Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Hitching Post podcast. My name is Clay Grossman. I'll be hosting this one today. I'm joined by my usual co-host, Paul Dehlinger.
Hello.
Colby Reynolds.
Howdy.
And today we actually have a special guest, Mr. Fonz Islas.
¿Qué onda?
Fonz is the current president of Tech's chapter of the Student Secular Alliance. I got that right. Fonz, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, man?
Basically, if I had to summarize it in a few sentences, I've lived all over the country, from North Dakota, Pennsylvania, California, Florida, and ended up in Texas, and really love this state. On top of that, I think I have particularly unique views, but I guess we'll see as the conversation progresses.
That's right. You've been everywhere, man. Right? But it's actually interesting.
Desert, man. I breathe the mountain air, man.
It's interesting because we met Fonz. We met you last year.
Yeah.
Right? You want to tell everybody when we met you, or maybe why we met you?
I actually don't think I remember exactly which situation you're referring to. Just remind me.
We at YCT does a lot of tabling, and we met Fonz indirectly just talking at the table and
I
stuff.
remember this actually.
And this was around the time, you may remember this, Lubbock was voting to be a sanctuary city for the unordinance, and Fonz, your group was campaigning against the ordinance. Is that correct?
Actually, no. So, I do remember that meeting. The first time we met was when Proposition A was up for election. And you guys were campaigning in favor. And the first time I passed by y'all's table, I was just going in to grab a snack, and I looked at it, kind of just brushed it off, and walked in. And then I came back out because I was like, you know what, it's worth it. And I decided to engage with y'all and hear you guys out on your reasons for standing for Proposition A instead of against it. And you guys actually helped spur me a little bit into activism because y'all let me know that there was going to be a protest and a counter protest. So I wanted to get involved with that.
Yeah. So one of the things I find super interesting about our friendship is the fact that you and I probably disagree on much more than we agree on some things, but the fact that we would make it cordial during that tense campaign season. So I just want to ask. So we have you started the Tech Secular Student Alliance, correct?
Yeah, we got started at the end of January of this year. Shortly after that protest, that specific protest, we met each other, and we were like, hey, there's more of us than we thought there was originally. Because when I first got to Texas Tech, that's the first thing I looked for. I looked for sort of like a community for people with similar beliefs to me. So I typed in secular, I typed in atheist, I typed in non-religious, pagan, Satanist. I went all over the place to try to look for an organization that wasn't religion-based. And I ended up learning that about over 55% of the organizations on Texas Tech's campus are religion-based, and they're the ones that are social organizations. And many of the other organizations are major specific. And so I kind of felt like, well, crud, I'm just SOL here. And so I joined the atheist community of Lubbock. Gen X or older, can't really.
Is that a tech group or a city group?
They're a local Lubbock group.
Oh, interesting.
Mm-hmm. So I joined them, and it was all Gen X or older. A lot of boomers, a lot of people who, I couldn't relate to as well. And while I was part of that group, I learned about the counter protest as well, but I blew it off again until I saw y'all's group in the free speech area, and I was like, maybe I should go to that counter protest. There might be some interesting things to learn here.
All right. It's interesting. So, Secular Student Alliance is a national organization. I was going to read off their mission statement.
Yeah.
To empower secular students to express themselves while providing a welcoming community to students, promoting secular values, and engaging in activism. Correct. Is that more or less what you try to strive for?
Yes. So whenever we're giving our little elevator pitch for the club, we always say, well, we're a two-face club. We've got one face, We've got one face, which is our community-based face. We are, kind of a social org for people who don't really fit into an organized religion or into any of the cookie-cutter religions to find a community with us. So again, pagan, Satanists, atheists, agnostics, Wiccas, but also we have our religious allies as well. So we have Hindus, we have Muslims, Christians, Mormons. I think we have a Sikh as well who decided to register with our club. So we try to find both our religious allies and, our non-religious folk to find a community. And then the other face of that is we are a registered political organization. We strive to push for separation of church and state. We don't want a religious monarchy. We don't want people making laws based only on their religion. We think people can't take people's religion away. The law can't take your religion away, but also you can't make your religion the law.
That last point is kind of what I want to expand on, because I feel like it gets kind of messy when you're like advocating for. I mean, would you agree with this, that all laws are a form of morality?
All laws are a form of morality. All of our current laws?
No, just in general.
Like the purpose of law is to sort of enforce morality?
Yeah, and from a deeper philosophical sense. I mean, you'll see a lot of things that you won't inherently think that they're a moral law, but I mean, at the root of that law is like a morality, it's speaking to.
I'm not inclined to agree with that, but I'm more open. I'm open to the case because it does seem to like make sense on some level.
I mean, well, I guess the point I was trying to get at, like, I feel like there's a lot of things that are laws that could come from a religious motivation, but don't necessarily inherently have to. Like, I'll give an example. It's kind of more of an out there one, but I would assume y'all don't have like a specific issue with like PETA, like people who advocate for like animal rights.
Well, we have an issue with certain like certain demonstration and certain communications that people have. So, for example, I'm perfectly fine with people going out to a peaceful protest to say that they are in favor of increasing the restrictions that animal producers have when it comes to treating their livestock, or a peaceful protest to decrease the restrictions that animal handlers have whenever they're testing their products on animals. The difference comes with your messaging. If you are intentionally just causing discord and you are trying to be problematic for the sake of being problematic, then I can't get on board with you specifically. I might even agree with you, but that particular type of messaging, that's a problem. And I think that's something that we are starting to see a lot, and that our society is going to eventually have to grapple with. We see this rising tide of people polarizing in opposite directions and not being willing to have these types of conversations like the one we're having here.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I kind of worded that wrong, but I mean, you did bring up a good point. This is kind of like right out of left field, but I mean, just talk about like the polarization. And I think that you saw this recently with, I don't know if you heard about the issue with like Kristen Cinema being followed into a bathroom because people were mad at like her.
I did. I saw the
her
video.
Not voting on, I guess the reconciliation bill. But yeah, I definitely get a sense of what you're saying. But I mean, back to my other point. That was more, you're talking more of a methods thing. What I was trying to get at is like, let's say it was somebody's completely peaceful, just doing it through like the normal like means. But I'm just saying, like, you could see like a law that's like advocating for like animal rights could come from a totally secular perspective. It's like, I think it's just really cruel to like treat animals like that. Or it could be the complete opposite. It's like, hey, like, the Quran says you got to be like more like, less cruel and more humane to animals. So like, I mean, I guess does your view, like, do you have a problem with like the specific law that somebody's trying to enforce, or is it the motivation for it?
I think I am most concerned with the method of enforcement and the effects of the law. So not really an ends justify the means mentality, but also not a means only mentality.
Mm-hmm.
I think that when it comes to morality, the way we derive morality is we find agreement amongst each other. So, for example, you and I'm sure, agree it's wrong to just kill people for no reason, just killing them because you feel like killing people. And then, of course, most of us would agree that inflicting unnecessary pain to people, we could agree that, just killing animals for no reason that you're not going to use at all would also probably be, not the most moral thing. And so these sort of like universal moral stances that we see throughout all of human history and throughout most cultures in the world, I call these sort of like our least common denominator morality. This is the stuff that, we can all sort of come to an agreement on.
So like a foundation or something, like other, I guess, moralities I guess, sub-moralities, if you can call it that, build off of those key concepts?
I would say that all moral systems sort of build off of this. And then, of course, like, I have my explanation for why we have this morality. So the way I would explain it is that we have a biological need to be moral in this sense because it's beneficial for our survival to be this way. If we're altruistic to one another, we end up benefiting one another, and that increases our chances of surviving, meaning we pass those altruistic traits and altruistic genes on to our offspring. The people who don't conform to that moral viewpoint, they're people who get ostracized from the group, they don't reproduce, or they get killed, or they kill themselves. Like there's these people who deviate from that in a natural setting typically wouldn't, their morality doesn't get passed down. And so I think the origins of morality come from our biology, but again, it's not really that important because we all agree on this morality existing at least.
Interesting. Colby, do you have anything you want to add on to that? I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
You go ahead, Paul, if you do have something.
It was interesting that you used like a biological component. I have heard that argument. There, I would say, is a certain amount of sense to it, but the problem I had was you argue that there's a benefit for passing down altruism, but I would argue that historically maybe there's been a benefit for being altruistic towards your in-group. But if you look at it historically, I mean, that's been reserved for the in-group, and you've seen societies being, very effective, but by exploiting an outside group.
Mm-hmm.
So like I don't see how you would argue that that altruism needs to pass down beyond the in-group.
Well, see, we can agree that groups, eventually fissure. Like, for example, I'm expecting sometime within the next few years for my organization to, fissure into a more left-leaning org and a right-leaning org. Y'all's organization, I know from prior, y'all, split between y'all and another.
So monarchists and libertarians.
Yeah, you guys, I think it's natural for when they become larger, they find differences and they split apart. So when we look past that sort of like splitting apart moment, we realize that we're all actually part of one big in-group. And so it's always a matter of perspective. If you're willing to see, they're them and we're us, and it's always this us versus them mentality, then yeah, your biological morality is going to lead you to protect your us, your in-group. But once you shift the perspective and you sort of train yourself, or you're raised in an environment that teaches you to be more accepting of the them as part of the us, then you start forming a larger group and you're less likely to engage in this intergroup violence and this intergroup extortion, if you would.
Yeah, I definitely love how you brought it into like an us versus them mentality, and like kind of how like groups are breaking apart. Because we can talk about your specific politics if you want, but just for us, I've definitely seen this. Like the Republican Party is definitely held on by just really anti-left sentiment. There's people like me who are very, very critical of Trump. There's people like that, think he's really close up there with like a god status. So there's definitely those two groups. Well, but I would say like on the left you see the same thing. Like the Bernie people really don't like what they call the neoliberals, like the Joe Manchins and Kristen Sinemas. It's actually funny. Like I've watched I've listened to Jacobin a little, which is a very far left website, and I kind of respect them in some ways because they're at least a little more honest, and I think they're a little more skeptical of some of the critical race theory stuff. But yeah, like they hate Joe Biden. Like they think he's a sellout. They think he represents everything that they're against. So I think on the right, on both sides, you can definitely have an outside looking in perspective. You're like, oh, they're all the same. They all agree. It's like, no, they don't agree at all. So. I'd kind of ask you about that. Like, where do you define yourself, and can you kind of expand on how you have right-leaning secularists that are kind of want to break up with the left-leaning secularists?
So where I find myself, I would say I'm a pragmatist. So I like evidence. So evidence, as I define it, is a state of reality that is indicative of some other state that we can't directly observe. So, for example,
do you base it off the scientific theory?
What do you mean by that?
Crap, I learned it in physics 1. Not scientific theory. It's scientific method. That was it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it like that?
You can definitely take the scientific method to try to find evidence, but it's not kind of like it's not what I would call the basis. It was
more like a
epistemic approach. Like the only way we know that things are real are through our senses, and I understand that our senses aren't completely trustworthy, but for the sake of practicality, we should trust our senses. So when we do this, we act under the assumption that most of what our senses are telling us is true. So under this viewpoint, there is reality. There is truth. Reality exists. Now, each of us has our own personal reality playing in our head, which is kind of like a representation of the reality we live in. And our reality may match up. Our reality may not match up. And so my whole goal is to try to match up with reality. I'm going to try to get my perspective to be as close to the truth as possible. I don't really care if it means bringing me more to the right. I don't care if it means bringing me more to the left. I don't care if it means bringing me closer to religion or further away from religion. As long as I'm getting closer to truth, or as long as I'm approximating truth, that's what I want.
So, you bring up, like I say, as you get closer to truth, right? Mm-hmm. Could you think of an instance where, as you've realized something, you've gone further to the right, and could you think of something where you've gone further to the left?
Yeah, totally. So let's say it's easier for me to think of an issue like where I went more towards the left right off the cuff. For example, on the issue that gender is a binary. It's a binary thing. I was thoroughly convinced that there was XY, XX. That's the end of it. That's all you needed in order to define gender or define sex. And as I started reading the articles that the biology department at Texas Tech had been putting out, and that other institutions had been putting out about how sex and gender are actually expressed through the reading of these chromosomes, it becomes a lot more complicated because there's not just that the chromosomes are present. There are people who, upon looking at them, we would say, oh, they're a female. They actually have an XY pair. But the expression of those chromosomes wasn't laid out in the typical way. So the typical way is that, you have an XY. During fetal development, you're more likely to develop a penis and more likely to develop testicles, and the chemistry in your brain is going to set itself up in a slightly different pattern. But there's a lot of steps between just having the XY and then it being expressed in your physique. So there are enzymes that transfer the information that might not get synthesized. There are enzymes that read the information that might also not get synthesized, or they might get synthesized and read the information incorrectly. And so this leads to more of a spectrum of sex. And I know that's a really common thing that, people say, oh, gender is a spectrum, and it's really easy to blow it off as just some sort of way of getting you to psychologically just accept that it's true. But when we look down to the nitty-gritty, to the evidence, to the biology, we can actually see that maybe the concept of it being a spectrum isn't that far off. Now, the concept of it being a spectrum probably didn't originate with biology. I think people, sort of took that from a philosophical perspective and then just decided to make it so. But biology actually seems to support that. That would be one instance where evidence has led me more towards the left. And an instance of leaning more towards the right, I would say probably with the little bit that I do know about economics. So, for example, we do observe that countries that don't submit to an authoritarian regime that controls all of the transactions of the market do have a more stable economy. And in general, the people who are worse off in a country that has a more freer market tend to do better than the people who are best off in a much more of course, excluding like an oligarchy or like a dictator. The people who do better off in those economies. And the comparison is very stark. I remember in Mexico, we have a very, very socialized sort of economic system. And there are a lot of government handouts. There is a lot of government assistance, quote unquote. But the government is so broke and so corrupt and so ineffective that it can't bring these things to fruition. And when they elected a new president in 2018,
I believe. You're talking about AMLO?
Yeah, AMLO.
I thought he got reelected.
Not yet. I mean, you can't get reelected in Mexico.
Yes, one 6-year term.
But when AMLO got elected, he proposed freeing up the market a lot more, allowing investors to sort of start up their businesses. And overall, Mexico has actually been improving. It's seen improvements. When I moved from Mexico, we still didn't have AMLO. When I moved from Mexico to the United States, like there was a stark contrast. And I know an argument can be made for like, well, the United States just ripped off other countries, and you only saw the good side of it, but you never saw the bad side of it. Sure, maybe. And I'm open to having that discussion and you presenting that evidence. But from what I've seen, it does seem like a more open and more free market, of course, with some restrictions, does seem to lend itself more towards benefiting people than a market that's completely controlled.
Interesting. I'll definitely give you some pushback on that first one, but yeah, I'm still a little curious on that second point you were making. Do you have like a hard time like convincing people like in your group about that? Like, I mean, because we were kind of talking about this earlier. We kind of feel like a lot of economic issues kind of get mixed in with cultural ones. So you have a lot of people who say they're socialists, but like if you like ask them about like seizing the means of production, they're kind of like lost. They're like, well, like I'm more of a socialist because I stand up for like reproductive rights or gay marriage, which really don't have anything to do with socialism, but they all kind of get mixed in together.
And I agree there. I don't think that reproductive rights or feminism or the promotion of science education or any issue that doesn't have directly to do with the market it can't be related to socialism because it's not directly related to economics. But I do think that there are some things that are related to economics that may not seem so. Like, for example, on the issue of discrimination, there are times when economic factors do seem to contribute to discrimination. Your position in the economic sort of like food chain will determine often how you're treated by your fellow members, how you're treated by the higher ups, how you're treated by the lower downs, etc. So it's kind of hard to like untangle the two of them. And I don't think they're completely separate, but there are some issues that like definitely are not separate.
No, I definitely agree with that. I mean, class is, something that is, at least quantifiable to some degree. And there's definitely a lot of that. I mean, the Republican Party is definitely kind of turning on this class issue where like we're always talking about the elites, and the elites could, usually means like academics, people on like, the coast and people from Hollywood. So yeah, no, I definitely agree. Like there are some class distinctions that, kind of affect us in the real life. I just don't like try to put an over like importance on it. And it's not like it's a like de facto class, not like an actual like in law, like you used to see in like Europe and stuff. So like when on the right we start talking about this, I do think sometimes people overreact to it. But yeah, to that first point, I see what you're saying, but the problem I have with this, and I think people, I don't want to just say on the left, but people in general will sometimes make is they'll take an exception to what is a rule and use that as like for the whole like system. I mean, you would say that humans are a dimorphic species where we have like, yeah. And so, like, there are, obviously, like the examples you showed where, and I always thought it, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I guess I haven't done as much research as you, but it's usually, isn't it like an XXY? Like you have like 3 chromosomes. Yeah, and that's where it kind of, but isn't it like usually manifests in like male genitals?
Yeah, but Klinefelter specifically is 2 X's, 2 X chromosomes, but that one in particular, it does usually result in someone living as a male or be with male testicles.
But like, I would kind of compare that to like, there are people that, are missing limbs like when they're born, but we wouldn't like use that to describe like, humans as like a species. We just say like, there are some humans that sometimes they have abnormalities and they, kind of, it comes out in this way where, missing legs, missing arms, or, restricted, cognitive abilities. But yeah, we don't like really describe the whole, organization or organism like that.
We'll see, but then we start getting into more of a numbers game because you're saying, well, it's an abnormality. Well, how unoften does it need to happen for it to be considered an abnormality? Like, for example, hermaphroditism happens as often as having red hair. And like in proportion to the total human population, that percentage is comparable to having red hair. We wouldn't go into saying, well, having red hair is abnormal, and we wouldn't call it, a defect to the general rule of having either black, blonde, or brown hair. And so when we start, getting more into numbers, we end up seeing that, like, well, the number of people who are born without limbs in comparison to the total population is much, much reduced to the number of people who are born with hermaphroditism. That's just a single condition. And then we're not just saying that, hermaphroditism is the only condition that, contributes to this idea of a gender spectrum. We have Klinefelters, for example. We have the name is elucidating me right now. It's a situation in which your gender that's assigned to you by your chromosomes, or your sex, I should say, isn't being expressed because you're not synthesizing the correct enzymes that read that particular piece of the genetic code. And so the default human body is a female body, because if you can interrupt, or if you have a cell that has an XY, and you don't allow the enzymes that read the XY, it will develop into a female body. That's just kind of the default body. And then because of all of the links, the delicate links that go from, just having the correct chromosomes to expressing those, can be messed up in so many different ways. Like, there's an interesting post that I saw from a biologist, and I don't think a post is good evidence, but the post on its own sort of kind of rings a little bit here. The biology professor explicitly states that while they have the equipment in the biology department, they would never allow students to take their own DNA and look to see what their chromosomes are, because when they did do that, when the one time the professor did do that, too many people were shocked at the fact that their chromosomes didn't match the identity that they claim to have.
Okay. That's okay. Like you said, you don't want to use a post as evidence, but
I don't think it's.
I would be really skeptical of that story. But yeah, I don't want to make the whole discussion about this. But to the point you made, and I thought you brought up some good points. But to the point you made about red hair, I would say there's a little difference between the color of your hair and your sexual organs. I mean, your hair color is like a cosmetic characteristic, opposed to your sexual organs, which are I guess more functional.
We can really get into that argument because
I mean, do you not? But would you not concede that? I mean, one is significantly more important towards how you exist as a human being than the other.
No, actually.
Really?
I think it actually goes more into how you are capable of making more human beings, and that's definitely an option that many people with genitals don't take. So, for example, a nun wouldn't take that option under the ideal condition. A priest, under the ideal condition, wouldn't take that option. But I do think it actually is more of a cosmetic thing, because we're no longer just apes running around on the savannah. We don't need to reproduce. As we become more and more urbanized, we see that the rate of population expansion is declining. And this can be directly attributed to, one, how expensive it is to have a child, but two, also the fact that having a child is kind of a luxury now. Now, of course, there are some specific subgroups, like, for example, religious groups or just cultural groups who view having children as sort of a rite of passage or essential to being a part of that group.
Well, I think we would view it more as a moral responsibility.
I don't think it is
well, no, I mean, from our perspective,
right?
But yeah, to your point, I mean, just because you don't act on the ability to have children, then I would say it's more essential than the color of your hair. I mean, that point is where I really have a strong disagreement with you.
I mean, and I guess we're probably not going to resolve this all in the one conversation here. But I still disagree. I don't think it is totally essential, or even much more essential than the color of your hair to be able to have children or to procreate. From an evolutionary perspective, yeah, it's extremely essential because that's how your genetic code gets passed down. But just from a practical perspective, it's not super essential. In fact, I would go so far as to consider it a detriment based on the for example, a lot of the gender gap when it comes to pay. There's a very strong association between having a child and your wages being substantially lower than someone who identifies as a man versus not having a child. When we account for the factor of having a child, we actually see a much more level playing field. So having a child definitely has an impact, and I wouldn't necessarily say it's a positive impact. There definitely are some emotional positives to it. There is some new form of love, if you would, that you can form with your child, a new relationship, a new experience. But essential, I wouldn't go to say that it's essential at all.
Interesting.
And that's based off, you said, the urbanization argument,
That's
pretty much?
part of it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up because it's a good segue. Because, like I said, I didn't want to harp on that too long, and it seems fair to give you the last word on that, where you can kind of get into like the economic side of it. Because at least from what I got, what you were saying is you do understand like the nuances in when people say gender pay gap. You understand like kind of like the reasons why that comes to be. I mean, the fact that you were talking about childbirth, okay, but you could at least like make that distinction, which a lot of people I think. I would say mainly on the left, would think it's like basically like, okay, like this job that a man and a woman are both doing, but I'm just really, it'd be really easier to give that woman like 70% of what I'm giving the man. And that's really what they think of it is, which that is not what the gender pay gap is. So it just seemed like you understood, that a little more deeply than I would say like the average person on the left we argue with.
And it might be a bit of a naive position, but I don't like assuming off the bat that people have negative intentions. I think it's a bad idea. That's a very bad. I don't assume that preachers in the free speech area are proselytizing just to make more revenue in whatever church they're. I don't like to assume that a person who opposes abortion rights is a person who just wants to control women's bodies. I don't like to assume that a person who is against welfare is a person who
hates the poor.
Yeah, hates the poor.
Yeah,
that's not. I hate making negative assumptions about people. It's like, well, I don't think anti-vaxxers are pro-disease. It's a fun little gimmick you can do. Like, it'll get you Facebook likes, but it's not going to get you anywhere closer to actually convincing a person who is an anti-vaxxer. It's not going to get you any closer to resolving the issue. It's just a bad place to start. Even with a person who is part of the what's the name of that one Baptist church that is like
Westboro?
Westboro.
Yeah.
Even a Westboro member, and if anyone who knows me hears this, I might get flack for it. Even a Westboro member, I would, if a Westboro member came to talk to me, even if they were yelling at me and saying all these profane things, I still wouldn't want to assume a negative from them, simply because that automatically puts you and them on the defensive, and you are much less likely to make any progress with each other.
Right. You know who you would find a lot of agreement with on that point, Fonz? Ben Shapiro. I'm sure he's your favorite political commentator, but he's always famous. He's always, if you watch a show, he's always famous for saying that
his wife's a doctor.
That, and that you should not assume the worst of somebody. You should not assume malice, is what he says a lot. So, let the headline be Fonz Islas, president of Secular Alliance, supports Ben Shapiro.
I thought it was going to be supports the Westboro Baptist Church.
I would. You did bring up an interesting point. Where Ben Shapiro talks about this a lot. That modern censorship, right? Censorship on free speech, right? Is one of his calling cards. He's specifically from a lot of the left, as you might figure, and there's definitely an argument for that. And inversely, I'm sure most liberals, especially historically, would argue that a lot of censorship of free speech and certain ideals comes from the church, these sort of right-wing political institutions. So I guess I'm curious, where do you see, because we talked a little bit about free speech earlier, where do you see a lot of the censorship or ignorance coming from in modern culture?
I'm going to need you to reframe. What do you mean that free speech originates from the church?
Yeah. So, or not originates. A lot of liberals, like you take about Tipper Gore, George Bush, right? Think about that. Would think culturally, right? There would be an anti-liberal or something along those lines, anti-church argument. So you go back to the 2000s, right? You see countercultural movements, right? I'm sure even if you look at the the Secular Student Alliance messaging, right? They would say that a lot of the free speech censorship we see comes from more right-wing sources, right? Like what you would call the church. You would say someone like George Bush, right? And on the inverse, more conservatives would argue that there is more censorship of free speech from the left. So I guess Do you think any argument is fair? Do you think that both sides are doing it, or do you think it's?
I'm gonna fall back. I'm gonna fall back on what Carl Sagan said. Everyone is pro freedom of speech until it comes to something that they disagree with, until it comes to something that they personally find as a thumbtack in their rear end. That is just an unfortunate fact about people as a whole, which is why it is important that everyone's free speech be treated well. In my opening speech for the semester, I outlined how, as an atheist, everything basically that I do could, in some way, if you try to dig deep enough, be considered blasphemy. And people, for a long time, really wanted to censor that kind of speech. On the other hand, I believe that a lot of people on the left want to censor, important forms of speech that expose people to ideas. Maybe they don't expose people to good ideas, but they still expose people to ideas. And the only resolution, the only thing that can really address a bad argument isn't censorship. It's a better argument. And to that I would say, I think that people on both sides do it. I think that, whenever we try to, take away the right of a person to, show up and start espousing whatever nonsense they want to espouse, that's still not a good thing. Now, there are, of course, limits. There is the shouting fire in the crowded theater thing, but looking into how that case came about is really unfortunate, because the person was taken to the court because he, I believe, was espousing pro-communist sentiment, or he wasn't anti-communist enough. And so he claimed that his free speech had been violated, and the court determined that if the speech is dangerous enough, maybe there are some loopholes for censoring. I agree with the court's interpretation. I disagree with how they used it against that person, which really makes it tricky. Like, for example, I believe last week, Pastor Greg Locke, was taken off of Twitter for some of the stuff he was saying, some of the stuff he was introducing. For starters, I don't think Twitter is a public platform. Twitter is a private company with, its private rights, and it has the right to take away a person's membership to being a part of that, or being a part of that group if they want to be. Now, an argument could be made that, social media is now the new town square, but, the town square doesn't require that you have a password and a username. So Twitter took him off, and people were coming out and they were like, oh, this is an example of people trying to censor the church and censor Christianity. And he wasn't censored because of his Christian beliefs. He was censored because he was encouraging people to not get vaccinated. He was encouraging people to not use masks, and was threatening acts of violence against people who would come into his church wearing a mask because they chose to wear a mask. He was threatening acts of violence against them. And so after this type of rhetoric and this type of behavior, Twitter decided, hey, that's enough. We're going to take away your platform, and we're just going to move on without you.
Yeah. Well, I guess on the free speech point, do any of y'all have any thoughts?
Yeah, I kind of want to let Colby kind of get on here in a second, because I feel like he's perhaps a lot to talk about, text censorship. But I did have one thing I wanted to tell you, and I wasn't sure if you're aware of it, just coming from the left. I mean, do you kind of know where the modern kind of free speech movement started?
I believe it's the Marketplace of Ideas. What was the name of the guy? Was it John Locke? No.
Well, I meant modern. So, if you go back to founding fathers, that was there. But I mean, as far, because it kind of in a reaction to the Red Scare in the 50s, there was a big, counterculture, demanding free speech from liberals, specifically from Berkeley. And to express this, they actually all dressed up as Nazis. And this is in Berkeley. And they invited an actual Nazi to come and speak at Berkeley to show how much they cared about free speech. I just bring that little tidbit up just in Berkeley in the 60s. So I just kind of how far they've gone with that. Because, you never really made this point, but there's definitely a lot of censorship coming from the right, a lot of it anti-communist, but, even in the 80s, or 90s, the big thing was we gotta censor video games because they're too violent. But yeah, I mean, you kind of made the thing talking about social media. So Colby, I feel like you probably have a lot to say about social media and censorship. Really, man, I feel like every time like we bring it up, you want to talk about it.
But I'll say if Colby doesn't have anything to add, I will make a broader point. I would say in modern times, especially we're talking where we live on a university town. I would even argue that it would be more so from the left. But you're right, Fonz, in a broader historical way, and frankly, in the individual way, at an individual level, you're right. Both sides fall victim to it. I would say culturally, though, we're more accepting of leftism than we have a conservatism in some ways.
And see, I think that perspective can actually be influenced by who is getting, censored, not why they're getting censored. So, for example, if we see, a common trend of, let's say, for example, that people who are Trump supporters are typically people who get censored, right? This is just an off the wall example, not meant to accuse anyone of anything.
Yeah.
A reasonable conclusion to draw from that would be like, oh, look, they're censoring people because they're Trump supporters. Like, no, that's correlation, not causation. Let's ask who's doing the censoring, why they're doing the censoring. And of course, taking it with a grain of salt because we know that they're wanting to cover their backs. But let's at least ask and then verify if what they're saying is true. And let's say that social media platforms have been removing people who are encouraging people not to wear a seatbelt. This is an example. Because some random tweet of Trump was like, yeah, the seatbelt example is so stupid, and people misinterpreted it in a way that said, you shouldn't wear a seatbelt. And people who fell into that sort of like stopped using a seatbelt. Well, and they started encouraging other people not to use a seatbelt. If the executives made that claim, and we find later that all of these accounts did recently, before being pulled, were recently advocating for people not wearing a seatbelt, and were advocating for an unsafe practice that was going to definitely negatively impact the health and well-being or even aliveness of people, then there seems to be a better reason for why the company decided to pull these accounts, or why the government decided to censor these people, or why the university decided to not allow certain people in the free speech area.
Do you think that can exist in a free speech, nation such as ourselves? Because I think we're supposed to be at the top in terms of free speech in the world.
Mm-hmm. Like, what do you mean? What do I think what can exist? Like the ability to censor?
The idea of, censorship for safety.
I think
because it kind of goes against the idea of a free speech nation.
I definitely think there's some personal responsibility involved. I think people should be smart enough on their own not to listen to whack jobs that are going about on the internet telling you not to wear a seatbelt because the government put microchips in the seatbelt to track everywhere you go, or some crap like that, and it gets activated when you buckle the seatbelt. Yeah. Like, people should be smart enough, but then there's a problem that people are not. And so the obvious solution to this, the long-term solution to this, is simply to educate people, to expose people to these views when they're young, and then show them why these views are flawed and how they can identify a flawed view. That's, of course, like an ideal long-term solution, and I think that is a solution people should implement. But as it stands right now, people don't have that sort of background. They don't have critical thinking skills, or they don't have the ability to be skeptical of certain things. And in those scenarios, because people pay their tax dollars to the government, and I ascribe to this sort of like idea that when you have a government, it's for your safety, and the more liberty you sacrifice, the more safety you get. But there's, of course, a tipping point there where
it's kind of
it's a very slippery slope. Yeah, it's like anything. It's like taking out a credit card. It's like, yeah, I'll just take 25 this time. I'll just take 50 this time. I'll just take 200 this time. You have to be cautious with that, of course. But the government is supposedly supposed to be there for the protection of the mass population. And so if people are compromising that safety, then it is kind of the government's responsibility to step in those situations.
Do you think that should be left at the federal level or state level, though? Because our Constitution is supposed to be heavily state enforced in most anything. It's supposed to be the Fed's just there to keep everyone together and provide a military. At least that was the original intention. The states pretty much handle their own things within their own borders.
Yeah, and see that gets more complicated because I don't think leaving it at any level. I don't think a state is better. A state constitution is better than a federal constitution, or that a federal law is better than a state law or a local law. Yeah, the smaller the government is, the closer it is to you, the more likely it is that you influenced it.
Yeah, the more relevant you are to its operation.
But that doesn't necessarily make it better. I would say, like, in a town where the majority of the population are a bunch of, sadomasochists. Yeah, sure. Maybe your local government is more representative of you. I wouldn't say that's necessarily the best thing for you. If you live in a state where the majority of the population is anti-seatbelt, yeah, sure, your government might represent you better, but that doesn't mean that it is better. Likewise, the federal government, sure, maybe the federals represent everyone better, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's better, because there was a point in which the majority of people were racist and were in favor of having an entire population of people in bondage. Like, just because the majority agrees with you doesn't mean you're in the right. Just because the minority agrees with you doesn't mean you're in the right. Just because the people around you agree with you does not mean you're in the right. There needs to be more to it than just what people think is right. It has to be backed up by evidence.
I mean, I definitely agree with that point. But I mean, the idea is not necessarily that a local government is going to be better, because I mean, better is kind of, unless we start going into like, deeper philosophy about like, what's objective truth, blah, blah, blah. But, I mean, it's like, it's not that it's inherently better. It's just like you have more of a say in it. And if, you don't like the way your city's run, you have like the ability to leave. I mean, it's kind of a bigger ask to say, well, like, just leave it, just leave your country. Like, that was one of the things there's on the right, there's like, if you don't like your country, just leave it. I was like, well, no, I mean, you should be able to like criticize your country without having to leave it. But, if Lubbock wants to have a $15 minimum wage, I would be against that. But I don't know if that's necessarily like, like, okay, well, maybe I won't start a business here or whatever. But, when things start getting like, shot down from on high, that's when I think it's like, well, like, maybe we should leave it down. Because I mean, like, rural states are a lot different than, heavily urban states. So I don't think, New Jersey and Wyoming should have the same gun policy. I think that's very, unrealistic. So I don't know. That's why I have a problem with, like, really, with most laws being handed down, from the federal government. Now, there are some, basic, rights that have to be enforced by the federal government. I mean, you mentioned slavery. So, like, yeah, obviously, like, you can't have you can't have a disagreement on that issue. But yeah, for most, I would say I don't really think it's the best for it to come out of the federal government, regardless of whether the law is better or worse. I mean, it's just like, well, like, what do I have a say in, and what do I want my community to exist
kind
like?
of leads into my next question. I don't know how we're doing on time here, but
About 48 minutes. You can go to the 5 and 10.
That went by fast.
Yeah. It always does. You get lost in the sauce of these discussions. But, it can kind of lead into a broader point about governance, views, points towards the world. If you had to say like one vision statement for how you'd want to change America, and I'll throw this out to all three. I'll start with Colby over here. What you would want to see different, operating wise, governmentally, even at a social level. What do you think that would be, man?
Definitely kind of what I was saying earlier, more state power, less federal power. I'm kind of the Reagan anti-big government sort of whole spiel he had.
Devolution, right? Something like that, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
like pretty much it, yeah. Big states having more, I don't know if more say is the right word, but
More independence over
Yeah.
like their own affairs.
yeah,
I
their
would.
own affairs.
Yeah,
Mm.
a less massive bureaucracy.
More to the
federal level,
original
right?
intention.
And you could have more say, like say we've been talking about. Is that kind of
Yeah, because I believe the Constitution's Constitution and the Declaration, though the Declaration's not as relevant.
yeah?
But
That Constitution is a living, breathing document too, right?
I believe it's based off like core principles of human morality. If that makes sense.
Okay. And what about you, Fonz? If you had one thing or a multitude of things you'd want to change about our governance and social politics and you name it, man.
I would want people to recognize more that there is a separation between church and state, that the legislature shall make no law regarding the establishment nor the pre-practice of religion. I think that many times people do not make that distinction. And I would be more than happy, or I would be exalted if people recognized that, their faith is faith, and they are more than entitled to their faith, but their faith isn't enough to, justify what they make other people do. And this sort of I think this would take care of a lot of problems. Like, for example, what we're seeing more as a trend now as the cultization of a subset of Trump supporters. People like Kat Kerr, or what's the name of that really famous mega preacher from Dallas?
From Dallas.
Joel Oseen's from Houston.
He's from Houston, but no.
The Fort Worth guy.
Yeah.
Oh, crap. What's his name?
I got the names actually.
There was that one preacher that
he blew on the screen. He blew the virus away.
There was also I forgot his name, but there was this other
Kenneth Copeland.
That's it. Yeah.
There's that other preacher that was in charge of a school, I think, and he was really pro-Trump, and it turned out he was like paying people to have sex with his wife while he watched.
Yeah.
Where was that?
I forgot his name. Falwell, Jerry Falwell Jr. Where was he paying somebody to have sex with his wife? A hotel.
Rest in peace at Liberty University.
I don't know.
Yeah. Okay.
I've got the names, like people like Kenneth Copeland, Greg Locke, Kat Kerr, Hank Kunneman, Robin Bullock, Rick Wiles, Johnny Enlow, Hank.
No, I'm sure there's a lot of people who think Trump's God. Like I hear you there. You're preaching to the choir here, buddy.
I'm not saying, but no. What I'm saying is, like, this is a much bigger issue. Just it's small now, but the speed at which it grew and the speed at which it's growing, where people genuinely have mixed their theology. They've woven Trump into their theology. There have been mega preachers who have literally said that they don't care about preaching about Jesus because they're preaching about Trump, the new Messiah. And we think it's like, oh, this is a small problem. No, these people have hundreds of thousands of followers, and they agree with these preachers. And this is a sort of like a rising problem that would be stemmed if we could really teach people to recognize that their theology can't go on top of our democracy.
Well, this all started. Some guy nailed something to like a door, and then now we're doing this. I think it's coming down to me. I mean, I definitely agree with what you're saying. It's a problem, mainly because, I think their religion's wrong. But I would like for people to realize not all problems or not only need, but can be fixed with a top-down government solution. A lot of these things are cultural. I think people talk about obesity a lot. It's like, yeah, I think obesity is a really big problem. I also think that's more of
personal responsibility.
Yeah, it's more like the responsibility of parents to be stricter on what their kids eat. Social media is another thing, but I don't know if it's the government's job to restrict social media use. I think it's parents' job to stop their kids, maybe don't buy your kid a smartphone. Now, I admit that's hard. I don't have kids, and I assume you don't want to make your kid the social pariah who doesn't get a smartphone. But I mean, yeah, we have to start making these decisions for ourselves. If I could, just for a little bit, and I don't want to drag this on too long, I didn't make this point earlier, but I feel like a lot of people on the right feel like there has basically become a secular religion with a lot of stuff on the left. I mean, as far as this group goes, I'm probably pretty pro-mass for a conservative, but I don't think this is debatable that the left has kind of made mass like a form of religious headwear for their side. I mean, you hear, I forgot who it was, Joy Reid or something, but she's like, yeah, I always double mask when I'm outside jogging. I was like, well, but that's crazy.
You're gonna die.
That's I mean, it's just one, you're outside, so it's not really necessary. But I mean, she's vaccinated, so she did all the things you're supposed to. It's like, but so why? It's like, oh, well, because it's showing everybody that I do the stuff I'm supposed to do because I'm part of this secular religion, as I would say. And this is not enough time for a whole debate on this. But the other point I'd make is we still kind of don't know, or I feel like we haven't kind of found the line where you say I can't enforce my religion on you. It was well, I mean, it's not true because we've done that a lot. The abolitionists enforced their religion on the South, and they said well, no, can't own slaves because that's immoral. And I would assume you would agree with that. It's a perfectly fine point. You just don't like their rationale for it, but you agree with the outcome of it.
You're perfectly right to say that. I agree with the outcome of it, and I totally disagree with the rationale behind it because it was the South who was more than happy to use Leviticus chapter 45 to, justify their treatment of slaves. And then the fact that Jesus Christ himself never really said anything about slavery, or Paul or Peter or any of the apostles who went out and condemned slavery. I think that the abolitionists really tortured the Bible in order to kind of extract an abolitionist, which, I mean, everyone does it. I don't think it's possible to not cherry pick the Bible. I mean, this is like a whole nother can of worms. But like they really had to torture the Bible to get their interpretation out. But then once they had that interpretation, now you can use that leverage to enforce the change that you wanted them.
Well, I mean, like, regardless of whether they were right with their interpretation or not, I mean, but that's what they did. They used that as their motivation, and they imposed it on the South.
I think I think the motivation came before the justification. They were motivated to do it because of their basic.
Really?
Yeah, their basic.
You think they were motivated to end slavery, so they used the Bible as an excuse, not the other way around?
Oh, I think people do that all the time.
I know. I don't disagree that people do that. It's just I don't think slavery is an example of it. I mean, so there's all these like people that don't really care much about religion, and then one day they're just like, we should probably end slavery. Let's find an excuse for it.
They were religious beforehand, and I do think that their religion probably informed their religion. Love your neighbor as you love yourself.
That was during like the Second Great Awakening. So
I think. Let me clarify. I'm not trying to get you to concede that the Bible is right on this issue. I'm trying to get you to concede that basically we did see like religion imposed through law, and I'm just like wondering like where you square the circle. I mean, maybe slavery is an unfair example, but like with some of these things where you would even be fine with the law, you just like don't like the motivations. Like, well, are they not allowed to enforce that law just because they have bad motivate, or which you would consider an unjust motivation? I mean,
I think if you have a bad justification for something, if you say you know something that you don't actually know, you are lying, even if you're right.
Most morals are things you don't know. You infer from, your, for us, religious beliefs, but for others, just like, you come up with some kind of humanist principle. I mean,
See, I don't, though. Like, that's another thing. Like, just because I'm an atheist and I'm non-religious, I don't ascribe to secular humanism either.
Well, I mean, I use that as an example, but I mean, what I'm saying is like not all morals are like come like from a scientific, kind of justification. Like we come up with like what we believe are like, inherent rights to humans, where, for us, we have like the, architecture of God and, I would say, well, yes, but even beyond that, just, I mean, I don't want to get into a natural law debate, but like, yeah, the Catholics put a lot of work into like, coming up with this structure for this, but, and for you, yours may be a different thing, but it is not inherently science-based. It's more like, philosophically based, I would assume.
I wouldn't say it's science-based because science can't really be used as like a basis.
For morality, yeah.
For a lot of things. Science is just kind of the method you use to find evidence, and then once you find the evidence, you let the evidence take you wherever it may lead. But what you said earlier is like, well, not all laws are derived from, like an evidence-based approach, a scientific approach. I would say hardly any, and not enough laws are derived from a evidence-based approach. Too many laws are just like, well, we're doing this because it just is the thing that we should do, and have absolutely little to no sort of consciousness about what the consequences are going to be of this.
Interesting. I think it's a good stopping point.
Thank you for coming by, Fonz. Do you have anything you want to plug?
Anything I want to plug? Make sure to pressure these guys into inviting me on here again, because I really enjoyed this. This is good.
It was pretty fun.
Yeah. Well, that sounds good, man. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for everyone who's listening. I want to special thank you as always to ISI, Intercollegiate Studies Institute, for sponsoring us, our audio editor Bre Brown, and obviously all of our listeners. So thank you guys, and y'all have a wonderful night.
This has been From the Brink.